Friday, October 14, 1971. The Marquee Club, London. 11:47 at night. The stage lights were burning. The microphones were live. The crowd, 60 people pressed into a room that smelled of cigarette smoke and spilled lager, had been waiting for 40 minutes. And the band that was supposed to be on that stage was nowhere near it. Claire Ashworth walked out alone. No guitar behind her. No bandmates. No introduction. Just a 24-year-old woman in a white dress, gripping a microphone with both hands, standing under a spotlight in front of the most important audience of her life, and about to say the words that no artist ever wants to say. She looked out at the room, at the industry people in the back rows already reaching for their coats, at the bar staff pretending not to watch, at 60 strangers who had come for a show that was not going to happen the way anyone planned. For a moment, no one moved. Then, Claire Ashworth leaned into the microphone and asked the question that should never have to be asked on the night that was supposed to change everything. Is there anyone here tonight who plays guitar? Our guitarist can't go on. We're not ready to cancel. We need someone. Silence dropped over the room like a curtain. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 2 men near the door quietly stood up and pulled on their jackets. Then, from the far corner of the room, a chair scraped against the wooden floor. A man in a plain dark jacket rose slowly from his seat. Long hair, quiet face. He looked like a roadie, or someone's older brother, or simply a man who had wandered in from the street to get out of the cold. Nobody looked twice at him. He raised one hand and said just 4 words. I can play a bit. Nobody in that room knew his name yet. In 12 minutes, they would never forget it. If you've ever believed that the right person shows up at exactly the right moment, stay with this story. Subscribe and don't miss what happened next. But to understand what that moment meant, you have to go back to where it all began and understand exactly how much the Ember Roads had already sacrificed before they ever set foot inside the Marquee Club. Claire Ashworth had grown up in a 2-bedroom house in Manchester, where music was something you listened to, not something you chased. Her father had said it plainly when she was 19. Music is a fantasy, Claire. Find something real. She had given herself 1 more year. That year had become 2. And tonight was supposed to be the night that proved every quiet doubt and every loud warning wrong. Thomas Reed, the bassist, was 26 years old and running on 4 hours of sleep. His wife had delivered their first child 4 months earlier. He was working construction from 6 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, driving straight to rehearsal, coming home after midnight. Every pound he spent on strings and studio time was a pound his family didn't have. He had told himself, 1 more push. Just this one night. Danny Holt, the drummer, was 22, the youngest, the one who still believed that wanting something badly enough was the same as deserving it. He had turned down a steady job at his uncle's print shop 3 weeks earlier because of this exact night. That decision was sitting in the back of his mind every hour since. And then there was Michael Shaw, the lead guitarist, the one who was not on that stage. Michael was backstage, doubled over, pale as paper, destroyed by food poisoning from a meal they had all shared that afternoon. He had tried twice to stand up and pick up his guitar. Twice his legs had refused. The club manager had pulled Claire aside 30 minutes before showtime and delivered the verdict with the compassion of a man reading a gas bill. There was no rescheduling. The industry people, including Raymond Cole, the senior A&R director from Polydor Records, had come tonight specifically for the Ember Roads. Cancel now, and this window did not reopen. Not next week, not ever. Raymond Cole sat at table 9 with a glass of scotch and an expression that had already decided the evening was a waste of his time. Claire looked at 3 bandmates trying not to fall apart, and 1 empty guitar stand that held everything they had built and everything they were about to lose. She had one idea left. It was desperate. It was embarrassing. She walked toward the stage anyway. Standing under that spotlight alone, Claire Ashworth did the bravest thing she had ever done in her life. Not the most talented, not the most prepared, the bravest. She leaned into the microphone and told the truth. She told 60 strangers, including the man from Polydor Records, who was already mentally composing his excuse to leave, that her guitarist was sick, that the show was in trouble, and that she was not ready to let it die without asking one honest question first. Her voice didn't shake, but anyone watching her hands could see what the microphone was costing her. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. 20 full seconds where nobody in the room moved or spoke. A woman near the front looked at the floor. The bartender polished the same glass 3 times. Raymond Cole glanced at his watch with the slow precision of a man making a point to no one in particular. Then the chair scraped. He didn't rush. That was the first thing Thomas noticed. Every other person in that room was frozen, and this man moved like someone who had already made his decision before he stood up. Calm, unhurried, certain in a way that had nothing to do with arrogance. He was somewhere in his late 20s, early 30s. Dark jacket, long dark hair that curled slightly at the collar. He carried no guitar case. He wore no backstage pass. He looked, if anything, like a man who had come to the marquee that night simply because he had nowhere better to be. He raised one hand, barely shoulder height, and said it quietly enough that the people in the back rows almost missed it. Claire exhaled for the first time in 10 minutes and waved him toward the stage. She told herself it didn't matter how good he was. Anything was better than silence. Anything was better than sending 60 people home and watching Raymond Cole disappear through the front door with their future in his coat pocket. The man stepped up onto the low stage and picked up Michael's Gretsch Country Gentleman without asking permission, which was the second thing Thomas noticed. Not hesitation. Not the careful, self-conscious handling of a man touching someone else's expensive instrument. He picked it up the way you pick up something that already belongs to your hands. He played 3 quiet notes to check the tuning. Then, without pausing, he adjusted 2 strings. Precise, immediate, certain, and the guitar answered him differently. Warmer, rounder, alive in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds earlier. He looked at Danny Holt across the kit. Danny was already looking back. Claire gave the stranger the key. She told him the opening song. He nodded once, like a man who had heard it before, somewhere, in some other life, and stepped to the microphone. Danny raised his sticks, clicked them once, twice, and everything began. The first chord landed, and something changed in the room. Not loudly, not dramatically. It changed the way the temperature changes when a window opens, quietly, and all at once, and in the way that made everyone present reach for a reason they couldn't name. The 2 men who had been heading for the door stopped walking. They didn't turn around yet. They just stopped. Claire came in on the vocal and felt it immediately. She had rehearsed this song 200 times. She knew exactly where it was supposed to feel strong and exactly where it tended to fall thin without a guitar carrying the low end of the melody. But tonight, nothing fell thin. Something beneath her voice was holding the entire structure up, the way a foundation holds a building, invisibly, completely, without asking for recognition. She sang better than she had ever sung it in rehearsal. She didn't know why until the first chorus ended. It was him, the way he listened while he played. Most guitarists, even good ones, play at a song. This man played inside it. Every note he chose was a response to something Claire's voice had just done. He was having a conversation with her in real time, and he was the best conversationalist in the room. Raymond Cole set down his scotch. The second song was a blues-driven number that Michael Shaw had written specifically to stretch his own technical range. Fast chord changes, a solo section in the bridge that required genuine precision and genuine feeling in equal measure. The stranger played it without a moment of hesitation. But he didn't play it the way Michael played it. He played it the way it was meant to sound, like a man who could hear the architecture of the song from the inside and knew exactly which walls were load-bearing. His solo didn't accelerate. It didn't show off. It built slowly, phrase by phrase, each idea finishing the thought of the one before it, until the whole thing arrived at a resolution so clean and so inevitable that several people in the audience exhaled audibly when it landed. A young woman near the front turned to her friend and whispered something. Her friend leaned in, listened to the next 8 bars, and went very still. Thomas had been watching the stranger's left hand the entire time. The fingering patterns, the way he shifted between positions without looking down, the particular motion on the high E string, a slight, almost invisible pull followed by a release that Thomas had seen executed with exactly that rhythm in exactly one place before. A concert film, one he had watched 4 times in a single weekend 2 years ago in a small flat in Islington with the curtains drawn and the volume at the limit of what the neighbors would tolerate. He looked at Danny. Danny had seen it too. Neither of them said a word. The third song was slower. A long instrumental passage ran through the center of it. 90 seconds of open guitar with no vocal, no distraction, nothing between the man and the instrument and the 60 people in that room. He built it the way a good storyteller builds a sentence, not rushing toward the end, trusting that the middle is where the meaning lives. And then, buried inside the final phrase of the solo, so briefly it could have been missed, so precisely it could not have been accidental, he played a melody. 8 notes, gentle, unmistakable, the opening line of something, his song, written by his hand, recorded 2 years earlier on the most famous album in the history of recorded music. The woman near the front stopped whispering. She turned fully toward the stage, both hands pressed flat against the table in front of her. Her friend had already risen slightly from her chair without realizing it. Then a voice from somewhere near the back of the room said it. Not a whisper, a full voice, cracked open with disbelief and absolute certainty. That's George Harrison. The word moved through the room like current through a wire. Raymond Cole stood up. George didn't stop playing. He didn't look up. He didn't acknowledge the name hanging in the air above 60 stunned and silent people. He kept his eyes on his hands and finished the phrase exactly the way he had started it. Clean, unhurried, and heartbreakingly precise. And for a long moment, the only sound in the Marquee Club was the guitar, and 60 people who had forgotten entirely how to breathe. The song ended. George Harrison stepped back from the microphone. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't smile at the crowd. He did something that nobody in that room expected from a man who had just played to stadiums of 50,000 people. He turned slightly toward Claire Ashworth, gave the smallest nod, barely a movement, barely anything, and waited, as if to say, "This is your stage, not mine." Claire stood at the microphone with 60 pairs of eyes on her, and the distinct sensation that the floor had shifted beneath her feet and had not yet decided where to settle. She looked at George, then at Thomas, who was standing with his bass hanging at his side and his mouth open, then at Danny, who had set down his sticks and was staring at the man beside her with the expression of someone doing mathematics they cannot make add up. She looked back at the room. Then she leaned into the microphone and said the only thing she could think to say. "I think our guest tonight might want to introduce himself." George Harrison stepped forward. He lifted the guitar strap over his shoulder with one hand and set the Gretsch gently against the monitor speaker. He moved to the microphone, looked out at the room for a quiet moment, and said it simply. No flourish, no performance, no pause for effect. "My name is George Harrison, and I just had the best time I've had in a very long time." The room came apart, not in pieces, all at once. 60 people erupting into sound and motion simultaneously. Chairs scraping back, voices colliding, a wave of noise that hit the low ceiling of the Marquee Club and came back down warmer than it left. Two women near the front were already in tears, without fully understanding why. The bartender put both hands flat on the bar and laughed. A real laugh, the kind that surprises the person it comes from. Raymond Cole moved first among the industry people. He crossed the room toward the stage with the converted urgency of a man who had just watched his own judgment be dismantled in real time. He reached for George's hand. George shook it, briefly, politely, and then turned deliberately and put his arm around Claire Ashworth's shoulder instead. Raymond Cole received the message without a word being spoken. After the noise settled, George didn't leave. He sat with the band at the side of the stage, 4 musicians who had arrived at the edge of losing everything, and he talked. Not about himself, about them. What he had heard in Claire's voice, what Thomas was doing in the low end that most bass players never trust themselves to try. What Danny had done rhythmically in the third song that made the whole structure breathe. He stayed for 40 minutes, and then he said something, quietly, privately, to all 4 of them together, that none of them repeated in a public interview for 30 years. What George Harrison said in those final 40 minutes is the part of this story that history almost lost entirely. Subscribe so you don't miss the rest. George Harrison in October 1971 was not the man the world believed him to be. From the outside, the picture looked like triumph. The Beatles had ended, yes, but George had emerged from the wreckage with All Things Must Pass, a triple album that had sold more than any solo record any Beatle had ever released. He had organized the concert for Bangladesh, the first major charity concert in rock history, and stood on a Madison Square Garden stage in front of the world. The newspapers called him the quiet one who had finally found his voice. What the newspapers didn't print was what was happening behind the voice. The legal battles over the Bangladesh concert recordings were suffocating. The money that was supposed to reach the refugees was frozen in disputes that had nothing to do with music, and everything to do with what happens when art collides with lawyers and accountants and men in suits who had never once played a note. John Lennon had said things publicly, sharp, careless things, that George had absorbed in silence because silence was the only dignified response available to him. The band that had defined his entire adult life was gone, and in its place was a legal entity being divided like furniture after a divorce. He had come to the Marquee that Friday night because he could not sleep, not to scout talent, not to be seen. He came because a small room with honest music was the only place left where none of that existed. When Claire Ashworth stepped to that microphone and asked 60 strangers for help, George Harrison didn't see a young singer in trouble. He saw the only thing that had ever made any of it worth doing. He told Thomas Reed the truth years later, in a handwritten letter that Thomas kept folded inside his wallet for 2 decades. I didn't stand up for your band. I stood up because I needed to remember that the music was still the reason. Not the name, not the history, just the music. That letter was sealed from the public for 20 years. What Thomas Reed did with it, on the night George Harrison died, is the final piece of this story. Raymond Cole signed the Ember Roads before the week was out. They released 2 albums. They never filled arenas. They never crossed into the kind of fame that puts a name on a billboard or a face on a magazine cover. But Claire Ashworth performed for 30 years to rooms full of people who came back every time, and that, she said in the last interview she ever gave, was the only measure that had ever mattered to her. Thomas Reed became a record producer. He spent the next 3 decades in studios, working with young artists who reminded him of what it felt like to be standing on the edge of everything with nothing left to lose. Above the mixing desk, In every studio he ever worked in every city, in every country, he kept one thing framed on the wall: a single sheet of handwritten paper. George Harrison's letter. On November 29th, 2001, the night George Harrison died, Thomas drove alone through the streets of London. He didn't go home. He didn't call anyone. He drove to the corner where the Marquee Club had stood, before it was converted and closed and eventually forgotten. And he parked the car and sat outside in the rain for 40 minutes without moving. He couldn't have explained it to anyone. He just needed to go back to the place where a stranger stood up. George Harrison spent his life searching for the spiritual behind the noise. Most people remember him for the songs, but on one Friday night in October, in a room that held 60 people and no cameras and no history being recorded, the most important thing he ever did was stand up from a corner table and say 4 quiet words: "I can play a bit." If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in the power of showing up. And subscribe, because the greatest stories are always the ones nobody planned.